All right, in this video what we're going to do is look at a couple of instances of making some classes and breathing life into them, instantiating them, whatever the current word is. I think it's instantiation. But the first thing we're going to do is sort of go back, harken back to when we were creating objects of type integer or string, and these would be variables. And we were doing exactly the same thing, which we talked about in class, and that is to use the parent class, and let's just use int as an example, int. And then I create one called myInt. Well, what I've done here is I've created a child instance of the parent object, which is int. And when I do that, I can use the dot operator right after the valid object name and access all the properties and methods that come from the parent class into the child. That's the whole power and beauty of what we're doing. Now here what I've got is just a basic form that I've created with one button, which I've called title create. Nothing fancy here. All it does is just load it. Now this form, whenever I drag and drop stuff on this main form that's created for you by the IDE, you don't really have access to that. That's not something that you have access to. What you're doing, or what the code behind is doing for you, is it's creating a child from this parent. So if you drop 4 or 5 buttons on there, that parent's going to have 4 or 5 buttons, and all the functionality of that form and all the properties you see over here in this right most window under properties will be available to that child. So the next question is, well, what if I want a program with more than one form? Well, that's a good question, and that's what I'm going to show you right now. So if you right click on the project name and go to add new item, let's add a new form, and I will call this my child form. Let's do that. Okay, and there's my new one. Now I've still got all these here. Let me close this out here, and there are my two. Okay, I could set different properties and so forth if I wanted to, but now that I've got this, let's go back. Let's put a way to close this thing out. And there's my button. I just added a button. This is my child form, and I'm going to go in here and change it to close, because that's what it's going to do. And then I'll change this to btn close, in keeping with good naming convention. Double click on this button. It creates a click event for that particular button, the close button, and I'm just going to type this.close. Now, that close method is inherited from the parent that we just created, but now we haven't instantiated the child yet, so as far as we know, this thing doesn't exist yet. So what I want to do is go back to the main form where it says create, and I want to load this thing. Now, I can't, and I've already had these in here, so don't freak out if you see a form main load and all that. That's just, you just double click on the form or add it from the interface over here if you want to. What I want to do is create a new instance of the parent my child form. Okay, I could have called it my parent form or whatever, probably would have been better. Nonetheless, I'm going to call this form. In fact, let me go back. I just violated my own naming rules here. I think that should be called FRM, my child. FRM, there we go. And yeah, I want to go ahead and fix everything. All right, now, what I want to do is create an instance of that. So it's, you go ahead and put the, just like when you're creating a variable, an object variable, and I'll call the parent my child form, and then I will say, I'll call this my form. Use the new operator, which actually inherits from it and breathes life into it, and then the parent again, and this is the constructor, which will create it into memory. All right, so now we have an instance of that form, but we can't do anything with it right now because we're not accessing it. But if I type in this name and hit the dot operator, I have access to all the properties and methods that came from the parent, which was a default Windows form. So guess what? There's a show method, if I'm not mistaken, and I can show that form. But I can also do things like, I can do anything I want to, just like I can with any object that I create. I can go in here, and let's just set the text properties something other than, you know, my child form. Let's set it equal to a new child, exclamation point, semicolon. All right, so now hopefully, my form, not that. Okay, now we can save everything, and run it. See what happens. See if we get any errors. All right, there's my main form with my create button. We're about to run this code right here. It's going to create an instance of my new form called my form from the parent, which is the one we added. It's going to set the property of that child to this and then show it. And there it is, a new child. See that? And there's my close method, and that sends us right back to this form. Of course, I can close it if I want. Well, that's pretty interesting, I guess, and it is useful, especially most programs have more than one form in there and not just dialog boxes. But sometimes we want to create classes as a file so that we can reuse this functionality that we create in our wonderful class and other objects and other programs. So back to the name of your program here, right-click, add. New item, and this time we want to add a class.cs for C#. And I'll call this, let's call this a person class, just for lack of a better example at the moment. There it is. So if I open it up, guess what I've got? I've got the code behind. Well, actually it opens in that. Now there are about 4 or 5 different sections of a class object that I want you to be familiar with. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and set up a region for each one that helps us to collapse and expand and get them out of the way, because some of these things get pretty big. This is the properties section. Okay, so this would be end region, and in here we're going to have one property for this particular class. Now you can have as many as you want, just like a form's got a text property, a name property, and all these different, and when to start at position, all these different things we've been setting. It's the setting. It's exactly the same thing. It's just a little different idea here. So these need to be private in order to keep any other object from going straight to these properties. Only the object itself, the class itself, should have access to this. And the next region that we set up, you'll understand a little bit better. So we're going to set the access specifier for this particular property, or object variable if you prefer, as private. Okay, let's make it of type string, and we'll call it str gender, because a person has a gender. So we'll set this to string.empty, and that'll get that. So now I've got my properties. I only got one object variable in here, or property. Okay, and that's what this is. You'll have a bunch more than that in most of these if they're of any use, but just for simplicity's sake. Region, for my next one, we call this the accessors. Whoops, sorry. Accessor. That's what this is, an accessor. End region. Now, this is the interface through which members of this person class that we inherit from the person class to create the children can get at this. All right? Only through this interface can it get at this. So if I want to allow somebody to change the gender, I can go ahead and set it that way. And then you set these properties. You can set up read write where it only reads and only writes, where it does both. We're going to do both. Now these will be public. Okay, they have to be, so that members of this class can get to them. Same type. I give it the same name. Typically it's spelled a little bit differently, but it allows me to understand exactly what's going on. And you have opening and closing quotes, curly braces. Now there are 2 parts. The get returns a value from the object. The set takes a value that you or some other object provides and sets that property of their string gender. Now if you don't want someone else to be able to set it, only to get it, then all you have is a get in here. If you want just set, then all you have is a set. If you want both read write, then you're going to use both of these. We're going to use both. And this has a little, whoops, this has a opening closing brace. Not wanting to act properly. Set, get, and set. Opening closing brace, and there's usually, you can put multiple lines of code in here if you want. Why am I getting that? Oh, okay, I don't have anything in there yet. All right. This is a return, because it's going to return whatever's stored in that property up here, which is string gender, and that's what we want to return. So str gender. And what this does is it allows us to have a certain level of security within a class so that we don't accidentally change things that we shouldn't be changing. And this one is going to set it based on a value that's coming in from another object equals, whoops, value. Now this one does a read and a write operation. So okay, so there we go. That's the only accessor we have. For every one of these, I would have some combination of one of these. So if I've got 50 properties, I'm going to have 50 accessors, each one dealing with a specific property. Okay. All right, let's save it so we don't lose everything and continue on. The next thing we need is our method area. Basically, there are two parts that define an object. One is properties that define the object, and methods. Those are tasks that the object does upon itself or other objects. Now, I don't really have anything to do in here, but we've already done methods. So I'm just going to basically define them in here. I could have one that says hello or, does whatever. It just depends on what you want to do. I'm not going to set that up right now because this is a very short example. But if I did have methods, they would go here. And this is a viable part of the object. Then I have constructors and destructors. Okay, let's talk about constructors. Whoops. Constructors, and there's always a default constructor whether you create one or not. They basically load objects into memory, and you can have different ones with the same name. It's just a task that has to take place when you use the new keyword. That's what happens here. So these are public as well. If you don't set one, it'll go ahead and do it for you. Let's go ahead and create ours. Person, and there's a certain syntax you use. This default constructor will not call any accessors. It just creates it and gives you access to it. And then I got another one that I'm going to call my custom constructor. It's named person as well. And I'm going to have one argument of type string, and we'll call this gender. So that that's all it's going to do. I just put those up there to save space. You could have put them at the end. It's up to you. So if I want to actually create an object and go ahead and set some properties, then I would use this custom constructor, which is what this one is here. Custom constructor. All right, this is the default constructor. There you go. All right, so now on to the next part, which is the actual final part. This region, and you don't have to use regions, I do, because these things usually get pretty big, so it's easier to collapse these and get them out of the way when you got thousands of lines of code in there. This is the destructors, and what a destructor actually does is remove things from memory when they're no longer being used and frees up resources. In C++, whenever you have a destructor that fires, it will actually remove everything from memory right at the point that it executes. That's C++. In C#, they have what's called garbage collection, which means that the compiler or your program in conjunction with the operating system, when it runs resources appear to be running low or there's nothing going on, it will go ahead and clean stuff up, but it only does it when it gets ready. It sees the need. So even though you may take something out of memory, or you think you're taking out of memory, your destructor may not run, or any destructor may not run until the garbage collector decides that's the correct approach. And you preface a destructor with a tilde. Again, you just use the name, and it's just, this is the default destructor. All right, so now there are all my aspects of that. I've got my region for properties, got my region for accessors, methods, which we don't have any methods. There's my constructors and my destructor. All right, let's save it. Now let's go back to the code behind. All right, now I've got a form load event here that will happen as the form begins to load into memory before it's ever shown. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an instance of my new class object called person, and I have to do that before I need to do it before everything shows up. So let's go ahead. There's my parent. Here's my child. There's the new creator, which calls the constructor, and let's go ahead and call the constructor the custom constructor and tell this to set that gender property to male, because it accepts a string and there's only one, and that's what that will do. So that will create an object of type person called myPerson, and that property will already be set through that constructor. Okay, now in form load, let's go ahead before anything shows up, and let's go ahead and use a message box to show us, or show the user, that that property actually exists. So it was my person, wasn't it? That's my child. Whoops. Excuse me. Dot gender. And see if that will show that to us before this runs. Let me save it. Run it. See if we got any errors. Okay. Oop, it didn't do it, did it? What's going on with that? Why did it not show that? Huh. Let me set a breakpoint and figure out, see if I can figure out what the deal is. Did I use the wrong thing? Go back to my class properties. Private. These should be public, are they? Yeah. String gender. It should have populated it. I don't know what's going on with that. String gender. I wonder if that's where the problem is. Yep. I forgot to put code in here, folks. So it did exactly what I asked it to do, which was nothing. So what I really need here is I need to call that accessor, which is gender, and pass it in what the constructor is receiving from the creating of that. And there it is. Okay.